Hi everyone, my name is Nana Kweku Akon. I'm a perioperative nurse and you're welcome to my YouTube channel. On this particular episode, we are going to have a discussion on surgical instrumentations. When we say surgical instruments are the instruments that are basically used for surgery. And all the instruments are classified under certain groups. They fall under certain groups per their use. So on this episode, we are going to break surgical instruments down to the simplest or the basic way for everybody to understand. Surgical instruments can be classified under 10 main groups. The first category of surgical instruments under its classification is the cutting and dissecting instruments. During surgeries, surgeons may have to cut the tissues, and after that, they may have to dissect the tissues open. So an example of a cutting and dissecting instrument is the Mayor's scissors, the surgeon's scissors that is used to cut through tissues. Another example of the cutting and dissecting instruments is the Mayor's scissors that is also used to cut, so it falls under the cutting and dissecting instruments. There are other examples of cutting and dissecting instruments like the jiggly saw, like the curettes. They are all used for cutting and they fall under the cutting and dissecting instrument. The second classification of surgical instruments is the clamping and occluding instruments. During surgery, when surgeons cut the tissues and then they dissect, there may be bleeders. So you may need the clamping and occluding instruments to clamp and occlude the bleeding vessels. So some examples of the clamping and occluding instruments are the hemostats, the intestinal clamps, etc. So the third category of surgical instruments is the grasping and holding instruments. As the name suggests, they are used for grasping and holding tissues during surgery. So some examples of the grasping and holding instruments are the Alice tissue forceps, the Babcock tissue forceps, the tenaculum, the bone holders, the Osner cockers. They are all used for grasping and holding tissues during surgery. So the fourth category of surgical instruments is the exposing and retracting instruments. Just like the name suggests, they are used for exposing and retracting tissues during surgery. Example of the exposing and retracting instruments are the retractors. We have the handheld retractors and then the self-retaining retractors, and they all fall under the exposing and retracting instruments. One example is the Army Navy retractor. It is used for retracting during surgery. We also have the Balfour retractors, we have the Rick retractors, we have the Catsport retractors, and they all fall under the exposing and retracting instrument. So the fifth category of surgical instrument, or the fifth classification of surgical instruments, is the suturing and stapling instruments. So just like the name suggests, suturing and stapling instruments are used to suture and staple tissues during surgery. An example is the stapler that is used to staple skin after surgery. Another example is the Mayor's needle holder that is used for holding the needle during suturing. The sixth category of surgical instrument, or the sixth classification of surgical instrument, is the viewing instrument. Just as the name suggests, viewing instruments are instruments that are used to view during surgery. Examples are the speculums, the endoscopes that are used for surgery. They all help us to view one way or the other during surgery. seventh classification of surgical instruments is the suctioning and aspirating instruments. And as usual, their names always give you a clue. They are used to suction and aspirate during surgery. Examples are the suction tips that we use in theater. So we have the Frazier, we have the pulley, we have the yankers, the cannulas. They are all used for suctioning and aspirating during surgeries. Category of surgical instruments is the probing and dilating instruments. The probing and dilating instruments, just as the name suggests, are used to probe and dilate during surgery. Examples of such instruments are the urethral dilators, the cervical dilators, and then the probe, which is used to test the depth of wounds or cavities. So the name always gives them away: dilating and probing instruments. The ninth category of surgical instruments is the measuring instrument. Just as you know, measuring instrument, the name always gives it away. So measuring instruments are instruments that are used to measure one way or the other during surgery. An example is the ruler. Another example is the tape measure. You can also add the probe to it because it is used to measure the depth of a cavity or the wound, and they all fall under the measuring instruments. So the last classification or category of surgical instruments are the accessory or the miscellaneous instruments. And these instruments are the additional ones that one way or the other may be needed during surgery. An example is the hammer. Another example is the malleable retractors that are used during surgery. And they fall under the miscellaneous category of surgical instruments.